distressed outside the bedroom window. We obviously said, well, we're very sorry, sir, madam, but there's no children that time of night playing. If there was, I'm sure the night porter would hear them. So we said to them, well, we'll keep a close eye tonight, and if we do hear anything, we'll better sort it out during the night for you. They came down next morning, and again, the lady especially, the husband never heard a thing, but the lady said, again, I'm sorry, but there's definitely children playing outside the bedroom window late at night, crying, being a bit distressed, also laughing, etc. So then, of course, it dawned on me about the story of the two children. So then I explained to them about the two children drowning in the river. And they said, well, we don't believe in ghosts. I'm sure it's more humanly than spiritually, as they say. So I said, well, we're having a look tonight. But again, same thing happened. They came down next morning and complained again. So then the lady and her husband went away. And we had a letter from the lady saying, can we come back to stay with you again in the hotel, in the very same room? Because unfortunately now, somehow, the children I can see at the edge of my own bed. So
they followed her home?
They followed her actually home. So the local vicar said the only way to get rid of them, if you like, is to come back and stay in the very same room you did, because they're more unhappy now than they were here. But however she must have cottoned on to them, we don't know. It must be how she's very perceptive to these things. So they came, had a complimentary night's stay. They stayed, went home, with a very nice letter saying, thank you very much, we have no more problems with the children anymore. So they brought them back for us, which was nice then, wasn't it?
Well, this is where they belong. I mean, they're buried here, aren't they?
That's right, they're buried. They're just buried round the corner, and later on I could possibly show you where they're actually buried.
Now, one of probably the most widely known stories about Ettington Park concerns one of the, well, there's a book. It's a book by Sir Walter Scott, which includes a verse in it by the poet Wordsworth. And that's significant. Now, talk us through that.
It is, because what happens there, the book on occasions comes flying out the bookcase and lands on the floor and always opens on the same verse. This has happened with a chambermaid who came through one morning to hoover and dust, etc. She was hoovering away and she heard a thud behind her. She looked behind her and the book had come out of the bookcase and landed on the verse that we're talking about. Also, some guests were sat behind on a settee, and behind them there is the bookcase, and they were having afternoon tea. And so it doesn't always happen. Doesn't always happen at night. So they were sat there having afternoon tea, and the book just came flying out for no good reason, and again landed on the same verse. That's in broad daylight.
There it is, St. Brendan's Well. A merry place 'tis said in days of yore, but something ails it now. The place is cursed.
So, hand on heart then, Robert. I mean, to what extent do you yourself, I mean, it's great stories, it's very attractive, a great stately pile like this that's steeped in history. It's fantastic, the notion that it's got ghosts and it's got poltergeists. But, you know, I know that professionally you have to put forward the stories, but do you really believe it all yourself?
If you'd asked me that 8 or so years ago before I came here, I'd have said no. But now, definitely, there is something in all the stories, because it just keeps happening, and there's no good apparent reason for any of it.
Croeso I Cymru. Welcome to Wales, land of the Red Dragon, Merlin, the King Under the Hill, myths, legends, and curiosities galore. The north coast of this red, green, and pleasant land is particularly rich in folklore and characters, and that's the area that we'll be exploring. One of the most curious of the architectural curiosities to be found on the North Wales coast lies here on the quayside at Conwy, and it is Britain's smallest house. And with me now is the lady who owns and indeed operates Britain's smallest house, Margaret Williams. Margaret, how long has this house been here?
Since the 16th century.
And how did it come to be built? Was it built for a small person?
Well, no, people were small in those days, of course. But what happened was, there's a row of houses over there, you see, and where that empty space is on the other side of the smallest house was another row of houses. And typically of this area, they built from each end. They started like that and met in the middle with a space.
Oh, I see.
Instead of building from one end to the other.
So originally that would have been, what, an alleyway or something?
It was just a space, so they filled it in, made a house. They only needed a wall and a roof and a chimney, you see. That's all.
Right. Now, how long has this house been in your possession?
Well, my possession since about 79. My mother had it before that. My great-grandfather owned it when it was occupied, and it was condemned in 1900, along with the other little houses. And it was just a chance thing it became a showplace, because he was having a drink one night with some of the local businessmen, and one of them was the editor of the local paper, who said this house could be the smallest in the country, you know. And I think he just acting on a journalist's hunch, you know, for a story. And the great-grandfather wasn't at all keen on the idea, but the editor persisted and really made him go around the country measuring small houses.
Oh, really? And so determined thereby that this is... Because, in
Yes.
fact, isn't it... were you in the Guinness Book of
Yes,
Records?
we're in the Guinness Book of Records, yes. And then at the turn of the century, you see, the railways had only just come to North Wales, and they were bringing the first trickle of visitors in here, and that's when it opened its doors to the public.
Well, who lived in the smallest house in Britain?
Well, the last person who lived in it was a fisherman who was 6'3" tall, believe it or not, but he was. And before that, an elderly couple lived here.
What, a couple lived in it?
Yes, a couple lived in it. And their descendants still live round about, and they call it their ancestral home.
Do they really? So this 6'3" fisherman, I mean, he couldn't have lain sideways on in the house because it's only 6 foot wide, isn't it?
That's all, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how high is it? What is it, 120?
122 inches, yes.
Tell me about this smell that you notice sometimes in the house, Margaret. And what does that tell you?
It's like salt water and fish. Trawlermen sometimes have it around them when they've come off a long trip. And it's we smell it very much so first thing in the morning when we open the house, and sometimes it lasts quite a long time, but it does fade eventually.
And what do you take that smell to be of?
Well, I think the fisherman's visiting.
What are the other sort of outlandish kind of stories that the house has generated? Because anything as curious as that is going to build up its own folklore and mythology, isn't it?
Yes, of course. Well, a lot of people say that the last tenant slept with his feet through the window. Well, apparently he did when he'd had a few pints. He didn't do it every night, you know, as a normal practice. Yeah. But apparently when he'd had a few drinks, he used to do it just to annoy people because they expected it of him, so he did.
Dear Lord. So, Margaret, Conwy is an ancient place, and it's a place that has got lots of stories to tell.
Oh, yes. Well, Plas Mawr is the Elizabethan mansion in the High Street. Now, you see, the Welsh were not allowed to build houses in the town when Edward I created a town here. It's purpose-built, as you know, and he brought in settlers from over the border. And in Tudor times, the Welsh were allowed to build. And Robert Wynne, who was of the Welsh aristocracy, lived at Gwydr Castle, Llanrwst, built Plas Mawr. Now, that was the first house to be built by a Welshman in the town. And he made it as flamboyant as he possibly could. I mean, just, I'll show them sort of thing, you know, it really could. And there are loads of ghosts in Plas Mawr. I mean, there's only one mentioned in the guidebook, that of Dr. Dick, who was a local practitioner who failed to save the life of the man of the house and fled up the chimney. And the knight who lived there is said to still walk around looking for him. Now, I haven't sort of seen anything of that one, but I live next door to Plas Mawr, and one morning I was washing up, and there was a flash of blue light in the yard, and there stood a little girl in a blue crinoline. And 2 seconds later she was gone. Now, I've seen her on a number of occasions, and now that they're doing some work on Plas Mawr, I think we'll probably see her again. She'll be disturbed.
Any idea who she is?
She's one of the Wynnes. She died aged about 10. I've looked her up in the parish registers.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a man in a tall hat and a cloak, and he goes through every night at 6:30, through my yard. He comes through the wall and goes through the backyard.
So what is it about Plas Mawr then that you think that it's got such a lot of psychic energy surrounding it? Was it a place of, you know, great activity, big parties?
Well, yes, it was. And talking of parties, the ghosts there have a party like a rave up at least about once a month. Yes, because there was a lady who was the caretaker a few years ago. She was in bed one night and she heard this rave up downstairs, and she thought her teenage sons had brought a load of people back, and she went down to throw them out, actually, and there was nobody in the room at all, and the boys were asleep upstairs.
Good.
And this has been heard by people living in the side street alongside Plas Mawr, the sounds of this party that goes on.
Right. But again, with all of these sort of apparitions and visitations, yes, and so on. I mean, there's no menace attached to any of this, is there? They're just generally boisterous.
Well, they are, and they just appear, you know. And of course, you see, Plas Mawr has quite an intriguing history because it played a part in the Civil War. It was, you know, one of the places that was a headquarters for the Welsh campaign, and it's a lot of intrigue went on, you see, as well. It's also got a priest's hiding place, so it could have been, you know, one of the places that the Catholics chose to, you know, hide their priests at the time when they were being persecuted. And there's quite a lot, you know, has happened there down the years.
Well, now I've come here to have a look around Plas Mawr for myself, and as Margaret rightly indicated, it is a building rich in historical and indeed architectural fascination. Building work was begun here in 1577 by Robert Wynne. Over the centuries, the place passed into the hands of the current owners, the Mostyn family. And indeed, the current Lord Mostyn, as with his predecessors, allows Plasmar to be used by the Royal Cambrian Academy of Art. It's a place that's definitely worth coming to have a look around. Well, now, before we leave this part of the North Wales coast, I'm going back down the road a wee bit to learn the legend of Prince Madoc. Prince Madoc, legend informs us, was a kindly sort of soul who set sail one day from Abergele, yes, we're back there again, in a boat named the Gwenan Gore. Where he and his crew were going, nobody seemed to know, and neither apparently did they, because a lot of them vanished for several years. Upon their return, though, they spoke glowingly of a wonderful land they discovered far away across the sea. A second crew was put together to revisit this fabled place, and that expedition vanished completely. Nothing more was heard of them ever. Their fate remains unknown. However, in the latter half of the 18th century, a Native American, Red Indian if you prefer, tribe called the Mandans were discovered, and they could speak Welsh. Evidence that Prince Madoc had discovered America? Very possibly. And what of the Gwenan Gorn? Well, legend insists that the boat to this very day plies the waters up and down off the coast of Abergele. This is the Rocking Stone. It's located high on a hillside overlooking Llandudno, and the story it has to tell is a fascinating one. Back in the days before judges, lawyers, and all of the ponderous apparatus of the legal machine, the ancient Welsh druids would use a stone, such as this one, as their very own method of determining a person's innocence or guilt. The way the system worked was this. An accused person would be blindfolded and made to place his finger on the only spot on the stone that was guaranteed to make it wobble. If the stone moved, the person was deemed to be innocent and let off. If the stone remained still, the person was deemed to be guilty and summarily thrown off the cliff to his certain doom. Oh dear. What with the Wordsworths, Beatrix Potter and the children's classic Swallows and Amazons, Britain's Lake District is famously associated with literature and such healthy outdoor pursuits as sailing and hiking. But there is another side to the Lakeland story, a darker side, because scattered throughout this most scenic of regions are places rich in legend and mythology, and few of them more so than Levens Hall at Milnthorpe near Kendal. The oldest parts of this, the largest Elizabethan house in the whole of Cumbria, date back to pre-Elizabethan times, about 1300. The place is owned by the Bagot family, and the current occupant, Mr. Hal Bagot, is waiting to explain to me why it is that Levens has long laboured under a curse.
Well, it all goes back a long time. It may be that this story is a Victorian dress-up of what actually happened in the house. That is, a succession of ladies lived in the house, and it didn't pass as it should, or these places should, from father to son so well. And maybe the Victorians produced a reason for that, or maybe it's true, who knows. Well, back in pre-Victorian times, it is thought, a lady came to the house who was genuinely destitute. She came to the front door and begged for food. And she was told, people of your place, I'm afraid, go round to the... Wouldn't happen these days, would it? But people of your place, go round to the back door and you'll be served the scraps from the table. She genuinely was, so the story goes, at death's door, starving. And she expired on the back drive, saying, as she did so,